time, given given his knowledge. I want to thank Rabbi Liebtag for filling in for me these past couple of shiurim, and also, of course, to Rabbi Bressler. Okay, everyone. I'll just give you a quick update in terms of how I'm doing. Baruch Hashem, I'm making very good progress. Thank God. We've had no real setbacks. I broke my hip in a fall about 5 weeks ago, and these types of injuries take time to fully heal. But Baruch Hashem, it's the type of injury which can fully heal. And again, I'm so happy to see the people who are here now, and very grateful for the tefillot of those who offered tefillot and those who sent cards and sent their best wishes. So thank you very, very much. All right. This week's parsha is that of the parsha of Tisa. And the parsha of Tisa is, of course, has a number of elements to it, as almost every parsha does. Very few parshiot are taken up completely with one episode. But this one, of course, the most acknowledged and certainly the most famous of the parshiot that we have, or the incidents that we have, is that of the Egel HaZahav. And Chazal tell us that, of course, now we are actually, even to this day, are somewhat still in the shadow of the Egel HaZahav. So tonight we're going to talk about the Egel HaZahav on two levels. The first question, the first issue, has to do with Moshe Rabbeinu himself. We're going to see how the Torah describes his reaction while he is on the mountain for 40 days. At least that was what was planned. Ultimately, Moshe Rabbeinu was on Har Sinai for 120 days, with only two intermittent periods where he came down. But this incident of the Egel HaZahav comes on his first elevation on Har Sinai to receive the Torah. So he is there. The Torah tells us in very graphic detail the way in which, or the background in which the Egel HaZahav, in which the Torah HaKadosha is given to Moshe Rabbeinu, and through the luchot, through the tablets, and here then the Jews miscalculated. According to Jewish tradition, what happened was that Moshe Rabbeinu said he's going to be up for 40 days, and they miscalculated according to some hours. They thought it would be the beginning of 40 days he would come down, and in fact, it wasn't at the beginning of the 40 days, and they became very agitated. As an entire nation, almost everyone became agitated. And of course, one of the questions we have to ask is, why did they become agitated? That we'll deal with at the end of today's discussion. But first, we're going to deal with Moshe Rabbeinu's response. HaKadosh Baruch Hu informs him as follows in Perek Lamed Aleph, Pasuk Zayin. Vayedaber Hashem el Moshe. Hashem, in the midst of the transfer of the Torah, or the giving of the Torah to Moshe Rabbeinu, sees what Moshe Rabbeinu does not see. He sees that the Jews, being agitated and afraid, rely on the only defense that they know, that of slaves and a response of people who were not in control of anything. We can all well imagine how it was. And so what did they do? They created their own image of God. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Moshe Rabbeinu, Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe, Lech Reid, go, descend. Ki shichet amcha, your nation, asher ha'aleita me'eretz Mitzrayim, they have perverted themselves, this nation which you have taken out of Mitzrayim. Of course, the first question that we can ask is, wait a minute, was it really Moshe Rabbeinu who took the Jewish people out of Mitzrayim? And why would it be called Amcha? Why would it be called your nation? because HaKadosh Baruch Hu says more than once in previous parshiot that this is God's nation. So it seems that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is almost transferring blame to Moshe Rabbeinu for the creation of the Egel HaZahav. And Chazal tell us part of it is because Moshe Rabbeinu pled for the Erev Rav. Moshe Rabbeinu, as the Jews were going out, and the Erev Rav wanted to accompany the Jews out of Mitzrayim and into Eretz Israel, Moshe Rabbeinu made a plea for them that, in fact, they should also be rendered and considered as the Jewish people. So, according to this medrash, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, "You wanted it, you got it." Ki shichet amecha, not all of the Jews necessarily, but Amacha, the instigators of this problem, were the very people that against and of course, when we talk about HaKadosh Baruch Hu's judgment, it's always his better judgment, because it's better than anything else. But Moshe Rabbeinu but Hashem allows us to make decisions. By the way, an important lesson in raising children, an important lesson in leadership, and that is that leaders are not the people who make others do their will. Leaders are people who guide and are willing to allow for mistakes. And in this case, of course, we have a horrific mistake. They have perverted through the Egel HaZahav, they have perverted their way. So now the Torah then uses now two words, which we're going to focus on for a moment. First, I'll read the pasuk, and then we'll go back to these two words. The two words are at the very beginning, pasuk chet, saru maher. They turned away quickly, meaning to say they didn't give any time. Once in their judgment, they believed that Moshe Rabbeinu was late. All of the fears that they had building up within them, that had been those fears which had been pronounced even at the time of the Yam Suf, all right, when they wanted to say, take us back to Mitzrayim, all of those now come rushing back to them. Saru maher, they have swiftly turned away, min haderech, from the path, asher tzivitim, which I have commanded them. And what have they done? Asu lahem egel masecha. They made for themselves a molten calf. We say a golden calf, but it was made from the ornaments and the jewelry of the Jews themselves. They willingly gave it for the purpose of creating a visual God for themselves, that they believed that God would redeem them and save them now that Moshe Rabbeinu was gone. Vayishtachavu lo, they have bowed down to it. Vayizbechu lo, they even actually offered sacrifices. Vayomru elu el Elohecha Yisrael, this is your God, asher he'elucha me'eretz Mitzrayim. So we have an image now which is rendered visually for the Jews to tell them, you want to know where God is? Here is God. You want to know where Moshe Rabbeinu is? Moshe is gone. So we now must rely upon this Egel HaZahav. Now, the Torah tells us that Moshe Rabbeinu does come down, and I'll read for you a passage. Moshe Rabbeinu comes down from the mountain, at least halfway down, and what does he see? He sees something more than God even told him. It was when Moshe Rabbeinu now came close to the camp. Vayar et ha'egel. He saw this calf. Cholot. What else did he see? He saw the dancing. Now Hashem did not tell him about the dancing. Moshe Rabbeinu saw cholot, dancing. Now the word cholot really comes from the word to dance in a circle. Sort of like a horror that we have. It's a type of dance which is not limited to the Middle East, but it's very common there. Vayar egel u'mecholot, he saw the calf and the dancing. Vayicharaf Moshe, Moshe became incensed. vayashlech miyadav, and he threw from his hands et haluchot, the very tablets that Hashem had given him, vayishaber otam tachat ahar, and he broke them or smashed them at the foot of the mountain. So we see here that, number one, the Torah tells us what Moshe Rabbeinu's emotional state was. Vayichar, he was very angry. And then it tells us the Torah uses two verbs to help us to understand what actually three, as I mentioned before. Saru maher means to say they quickly abandoned plan A and went to plan B. The second thing is vayashlech miyadav, that Moshe Rabbeinu threw the tablets from his hands, threw them. That seems to indicate intent. It seems to indicate that Moshe Rabbeinu intentionally broke them. And then the Torah uses another verb form, vayishaber otam vayishaber otam tachat ahar. He broke them then, but more than just break. L'shaber is to smash. I'll explain in a moment. At the foot of the mountain. Now, in Hebrew, of course, we can indicate. We have what we call we have a basic verb forms. Kal, nifal, piel. These are all constructs, and they can actually change. Even though they all have the same basic idea of what a verb means, but nevertheless, if you use one form, it may or may not be intentional. For example, ani shover, I break. To break, we don't know. If I say I broke the dish, it doesn't mean that I intended to do it necessarily, and it certainly doesn't mean that I did it with any intensity. But we can add when we add and change the form from kal to piel, from ani shover to ani mishaber or ani shibarti, then two things happen. Number one, smashing always indicates some degree of intent. Number two, of course, it also indicates intensity, intent and intensity. Notice here, the Torah uses specifically, when it talks about the breaking of the luchot, it says vayishaber otam, which seems to indicate that Moshe Rabbeinu actually was engaged in a deliberate break of the luchot. Of course, one of the questions is, by what right does he have to do that? If indeed it is true that he did it deliberately. So we're going to talk a little bit now about what caused Moshe Rabbeinu to become incensed when he saw them. Now, there is a concept within Judaism, not just within Judaism, but we use it often. Eino dome shmiya l'riyah. You cannot compare things that are heard with things which are actually seen. So of course, one can be told about slavery, whether it's the slavery that was imposed upon the African now that are African Americans, or the slavery that was imposed upon Jews, or the horrific Holocaust. When we hear about it, it's one thing. To see visual imagery through videos and through film, so that of course intensifies, and you cannot compare what we read about it to when we see it. That works in the negative sense. Now, of course, it also can work in the positive sense. Most of us have certainly heard, and many of us have also seen the Niagara Falls. Okay? But if you read about Niagara Falls and don't see a picture about Niagara Falls, you have a certain idea. But I remember when we came there and when we saw the family, when we saw it even from a distance, and as we got closer and as we took that boat ride to get toward the Maid of the Mist, to get toward the falls, you could hear the rush of the falls. You could see the water hundreds of thousands of gallons of water per second, per minute, coming down, then you can honestly say, Eino dome shmiya l'riyah. Hearing about something is one thing, but to see a magnificent event, whether good or positive, like Niagara Falls or like the Grand Canyon, that in itself intensifies the image that we have and the way we look at it. Moshe Rabbeinu heard from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Lech ki shichet amcha, go down, Lech raid, go down and see them. And Moshe Rabbeinu, of course, did exactly what Hashem said. But it was only when he saw the dancing and he saw the revelry that took place, he realized that this is a situation that is not redeemable. For example, the Medrash Rabbah tells us that Moshe Rabbeinu came down from the top of the mountain, but he didn't break the tablets, even though God told them that they perverted themselves already and that they made an egel azab. He didn't break the tablets there. Where did he break it? He broke it when he saw it. Vayi kasher karav el hamachne, when he came close. Vayar, and he saw et ha'egel with his own eyes. He saw this corruption. That moment, Moshe Rabbeinu became incensed, enraged, and then he broke the tablets. Now, the Medrash, by the way, this Medrash Rabbah does what it often does. It creates a little bit of dialogue. And the dialogue is as follows. Amar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now God speaks, and it's not mentioned in the Torah. It's not mentioned specifically about God's response to Moshe's anger. Amar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Moshe, lo ayita ma'amin li she'asu lahem egel? Moshe, what? You didn't, what? I told you they made an egel. I used the word. I told you they perverted their way. You weren't incensed until you see it yourself. This is a part of human nature. Even if it is God who tells, even if it is God who told even Moshe Rabbeinu, once we are confronted face to face with the situation, whether good or bad, it is then, of course, that our intense emotions set in, and so that is when Moshe Rabbeinu threw the luchot down and became incensed. Now there are other Meforshim who are talking about this as well, and the Torah tells us that when Moshe Rabbeinu did not throw the luchot down until Vayar et ha'egel cholot. He saw the egel, saw the calf. That wasn't all he saw. He saw the mecholot. He saw the revelry. He saw the dancing. And that is what convinced him, not just the egel, because the truth is they had nothing. They were at the 49th level of Tumah when they left Mitzrayim. Chazal tell us they were just an nth degree away from becoming Ovdei Avodah Zarah when they were snatched out of Mitzrayim through the series of the Makot, etc. But that probably did not make the impression upon Moshe Rabbeinu, the Egel HaZahav, as much as he saw the dancing. When the Egel was associated with dancing and simcha, that's when he saw the situation is not redeemable, and that's when he broke the luchot. Now, the Alshich HaKadosh lived at the time of the Shulchan Aruch, Yosef Karo, and that's about in the year around roughly 1500. He was a Talmud of Rabbi Yosef Karo, and he was known as a brilliant orator and a wonderful writer, and we have pretty much the complete works that he wrote, and it says he wrote as follows. He says, when it comes to the principal service to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we have a rule. The rule is that it should be Ivdu et Hashem b'simcha. When it comes to serving Hashem, we have a mitzvah of simcha. As a matter of fact, the Torah tells us that when, God forbid, we run into a situation of destruction, so Hashem says that, or Churban, so it's because Tachat Asher Lo Avavta Hashem B'Simcha, that it came about because the element, this emotional element of Simcha was missing to you. You may have performed the mitzvah of tefillin. You may have performed mitzvah, but they were a form of drudgery. We'll talk a little more about that in a couple of minutes, but it was more drudgery, more a sense of obligation or burden than it was simcha. So the Alshich says the same principle applies the opposite. When it comes to disregarding God's will, okay? So if they, ach hasameach ba'avono, a person who is happy in actual performance of something which is wrong, of that tikvato, chas v'sholom. So just as when a person is performing a mitzvah to serve Hashem, it should be done with simcha. Moshe Rabbeinu realized that when people do the opposite and they engage in inappropriate behavior, this is more than inappropriate, of course, the actual opposite of serving HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it's one thing to do it. It's another thing when there is a revelry and a simcha, a certain, as people say, gishmak in doing wrong. When the gishmak is there, that Moshe Rabbeinu saw required a very, shall we say, an action that would get everyone's intention. Now, Abravanel tells us that he threw it down b'tachti tahar. He got close to the camp and threw the luchot down and broke them. And it was why does the Torah go out of its way to tell us b'tachti tahar? Moshe Rabbeinu did it, at least according to Abravanel, to make an impression upon Klal Yisrael. The very place which was their camp, and that camp itself became the shining glory of the Jewish people. They were encamped around Har Sinai for the giving of the Torah. They moved, all of their movements in the desert were a part of the camp. Now what do they have left? They have the broken tablets. And that Moshe Rabbeinu, at least according to Abravanel, was done for the purpose of demonstrating how horrifying their actions were. Now, this goes according to the view that that Moshe Rabbeinu did this intentionally. We're going to come back to it in a moment, but there are others who say that it wasn't intentional. Moshe Rabbeinu did not deliberately break the tablets. Now, we do have a problem with the argument that it was an accident because, again, if you recall, the verb form, shibarta, is in pi'el. And that usually indicates there was intent. Shavarti et bakbuk, I broke the bottle. Well, that could happen either intentionally or unintentionally, but shibarti, two things happened. One, I did it intentionally, it looks like, and I certainly smashed it. So the Torah does use the more intensified form of what we call binyan. There are 7 binyanim, and the more intense form is piyal over kal. So that leads us to say that it probably, there was some degree of intent involved. However, others say that we should not become so wedded to the idea that Moshe Rabbeinu did it intensely, with intention, because the Medrash tells us, and this Medrash is quoted by the Malbim. He says, that once they served the Avodah Zorah, the letters on the luchot, porchot, they left the luchot, they left the tablets. And what happened? The tablets, which were so animated when Moshe Rabbeinu had them directly from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, now become lifeless, heavy, and he's incapable of carrying them, and so therefore they were broken. Now, we know that in halacha, there's a concept of chai nose et atzmo. I mean, the concept of, halacha concept that a living person is never completely dormant or without animation. And a person who is alive, it seems to weigh less than one who is lifeless. So this idea, and again, that's a physical truth, but of course then it applies in halacha as well regarding Shabbos. But we're not going to go into that. But the idea is, you can imagine, here are the luchot, animated by the word of HaKadosh Baruch Hu through the writing of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself wrote. It was Etzba Elokim. It was with the word, it was with so to speak, Kivayachol, the finger of God that brought it. And so when Moshe Rabbeinu saw the Egel, and when the Egel was made, all Moshe Rabbeinu was holding was heavy stone. And so he dropped it. And so another view is, Chizkoni's view is the very sight of the mecholot, the very sight of the dancing, the revelry, and all that was taking place. You can imagine Moshe Rabbeinu comes from the world of God, where HaKadosh Baruch Hu was speaking to him panim el panim, and then he goes down, and literally simultaneously, the Jews are engaged in this wild revelry in the service of the Egel. So Moshe Rabbeinu, according to Chizkuni and others, the Rashbam, I believe too, was so overcome emotionally that he dropped them. He couldn't hold them anymore, and it took, so to speak, as we have a phrase in English, it takes your breath away. Well, it took Moshe Rabbeinu's strength away, and he dropped the luchot. Now, the Gemara tells us, the Gemara in Shabbos, toward the end of Shabbos, the Gemara says to us that, once again, looking at, as I mentioned before, the binyan, looking again at the formulation and the construct of the verbs, seems to indicate Moshe Rabbeinu did it on purpose. The Gemara in Shabbos accepts that view. That Moshe Rabbeinu, when he did it, when he broke the luchot, when he smashed the luchot, he did it b'chavana. He did it with intent. And the Gemara says, Tanya, we learned in a brayso, Shlosha dvarim asa Moshe midato v'hiskim HaKadosh Baruch Hu imo. That HaKadosh Baruch Hu performed 3 actions on his own, without the direct direction and guidance of God. V'hiskim HaKadosh Baruch Hu imo. Once Moshe Rabbeinu did it, God agreed to it. And it is, among them was, Shiber et haluchot. He smashed the luchot, indicating that he did it of his own accord, and he did it on purpose. Uminalan dehiskim HaKadosh Baruch Hu al yado. How do we know that God ultimately said that that he agreed that this was the appropriate response to the Egel and the Mecholot? Because HaKadosh Shenemar, because the Torah adds the words Asher Shibartu, the luchot which you smashed. In other words, they were now to have replacement luchot, replacement tablets. And Hashem said, these will replace haluchot asher shibarta, which you smashed. And the Gemara says, why does the Torah use that term? Because it's lashon isher. It is an expression of an agreement that HaKadosh Baruch Hu had. Yasher koach, when somebody gets an aliyah, or when someone does something which is meritorious, so he say Yasher koach. What do you mean Yasher koach? First of all, I'm mispronouncing it, but Yasher koach means to say, congratulations, you did well here, may you continue to do well. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, Yasher kochacha sheshibar. You did well here. This was the appropriate and correct response that you needed to do in order to impress upon the Jews for all the ages that we dare not, we may not, there is no substitute for God, and there is no substitute for Hashem's Torah. And of course, once he did that, so now HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells him, now you're going to, as evidence of that, the Jews are going to get a second chance, and we get a second set of luchot. These are some of the explanations. So on one side, the belief is Moshe Rabbeinu broke the luchot just out of sheer loss of strength. When something devastating occurs, weak and lose strength. Toshash kocho, the Gemara says, that he became completely weak, and therefore the tablets fell. And another view is that the letters that flew off the tablets reduced them purely to heavy stone, and therefore Moshe couldn't continue to hold them. That's one view. The other view is that it was done intentionally, and we saw different views. One view is that he did it intentionally because of the fact that it was accompanied by simcha, that he when he broke them, it wasn't impulsive. He saw it. He saw what they were doing, and he saw they were happy, and therefore he broke it. Another view is, and there are other views as well, but we're not going to go into all of them. Eno doma shmiya l'riyah. It's one thing when even God tells you something. It's another thing to see it b'mo einecha, with your own eyes. I just want to conclude today with a second element, and that is, of course, how could they? By the way, it's very easy for all of us to say, how could Adam have eaten when Hashem told him don't eat from the Eitz Hadat? How could this? God tells you don't do it. Why would he do it? The truth is, as I've mentioned many times, the scene and the setting certainly has to do with, it could be Adam HaRishon, it could be Moshe Rabbeinu, it could be Klal Yisrael. We really don't have much evidence that we would act differently. We'd like to believe we would, but we don't know that that's true. So here, I'd like to point out that, I'm sorry. 1 second. I'd like to point out that here, I'd like to make a distinction between Nes and Pele. For more than a year, the Jewish people, and by the way, they were not that far away from Mitzrayim at this point yet. They were 40 years in the desert, but this is at the beginning of their sojourn in the desert. There are two words that we have in Hebrew that indicate HaKadosh Baruch Hu's direct and divine intervention on behalf of people. The first is Nes. Now, the word Nes, as I've mentioned in the past, means something which is held aloft. The mast on a boat is called a Nes, meaning to say it can be seen from very far away. What is a Nes when we say a Nes happened to me? A Nes is that which anybody who sees it and who is rational can see that this is beyond that which is natural. And certainly you'd see at Mitzrayim, but I would add the 6-Day War, something of that nature. If you want to see a Nes that if anybody had written about it before it happened, the person who wrote a book on the 6-Day War and called it the 6-Day War before it happened probably would sell one copy, and that one copy, his mother would say to him, don't write another book, because it defies all imagination. HaKadosh Baruch Hu also affects our lives in a different way too. And by the way, a Nes is usually a one-time thing. Once it happens, then it loses its complete stature of Nes, because it happened. Pele comes from the Hebrew word to lechasot, to cover. Hayipale me Hashem davar. Is anything covered, or is God incapable, meaning say covered. It's beyond his ability. So the word Pele are the day-to-day events that happen in our lives, that happen so often we just come to expect them. And when they don't occur, or something interrupts that, what we would consider to be a natural flow, we become agitated. We don't appreciate it when it happens, and then when it doesn't happen, or when we don't get what we expect, then we indeed become uncertain about ourselves. Now, what was it about Yetziat Mitzrayim? For more than a year, Jews had seen on a daily basis makot, supernatural things that occurred to their masters and were thrust upon their masters, that they realized they almost came to expect it. So the Nes this supernatural intervention becomes Pele. It becomes something which Jews began to expect. After Dam, they expected the next one, Tzvardeya. And after Tzvardeya, they expected something which came Kinim, et cetera, because each of these came and were on a daily basis. When they finally came to Kriyat Yamsuf, and then they finally came ultimately to the giving of the Torah on Har Sinai. So there, now the nace, what was once a nace unthinkable in its goodness, becomes something that should be expected. So when the Jews thought that Moshe Rabbeinu would be coming down on time, they expected a certain outcome. And when their flawed expectations were not met, then that's when the trouble of the Egel HaZahav happened, because the nisim that they experienced day after day, month after month, had become for them just daily occurrences. And when a daily occurrence doesn't happen, then we can become distraught and distressed. And that may have contributed to the making of the Egel HaZahav. So again, I want to thank you for joining. I thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu that my recovery is going smoothly. Now, it's not going quickly, but it's going smoothly. So, Emir Hashem, I hope that next week we will meet again on Wednesday night. And again, my thanks to Rabbi Litek, to Rabbi Bressler, to Rabbi Matanki, to all who have set up this Zoom session. Okay, Erev Tov, everybody. Shabbat Shalom.
Yasher Koach for Fush.
Welcome back.
Welcome back.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yasher Koach.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Thank you for coming.
He's good. I didn't know he lived here in Chicago. You've heard his name before?